Have you ever got to a place in life where you just throw up your hands and say, what's the point? You've been working, you've been sacrificing, you've been looking to serve everybody else around you, and yet it seems like there's no return. And even your best hopes seem to be disappointed. I think all of us have experienced that at one point or another. But the heart of this truly are our expectations. Our willingness to sacrifice and do good and do what is right, even if it costs us a lot, is important. But expectations of that response or that harvest of return often are a heart of that very struggling point where we say, I don't think it's worth it. Now, if we're looking to our own efforts alone to create that good in our life that we expect, we're going to be in trouble because we're not enough. We are never going to have the sufficiency in ourselves to create a good for us ultimately. Now, we can be a part of that, and God has called us to that. But we have to sacrifice our own perspective of good at times to entrust ourselves to God, who's promised, if we're walking with Him, that all these things will work together for a good, an eternal good, an everlasting good to those that love Him. So, of course, the first question is this really for God? Do I really love Him, and am I close to Him? If you haven't answered those questions first, I'd really love to be able to walk through that with you. Even if you reach out to us, you know that we're here to answer any questions and partner with you in this as much as we can. But for those of us that do know that, and maybe you've been struggling, maybe that's you right now, I've got a couple of verses I want to share with you. And really the title of this in my mind was The Reward of Doing Good. The truth is, God is the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. He's also the rewarder of those that do what is right. Now, this good sometimes doesn't come immediately, and you've probably sensed that if you've tried to follow Him. But just in this past week, if you were with us or if you watched that video from this past week's message and services that we held on Sunday, you know that one of those passages we looked at was Galatians chapter 6. And there we're told, this is a command, do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season you will reap. Now, of course, that's in the context of investing in one another, in the church, and doing good, and investing in that greater good within the body of Christ. But the general principle of not growing weary is important. It's really easy to do that, and it's easy for us to lose perspective on really what we are investing in. The promise in Galatians 6 is that there is a time where we will reap that reward. And I know sometimes it can be harder when we don't see it immediately. But there is a season of reward, and that's something we need to remember when we're getting discouraged. Of course, that message from last week was to focus on encouraging one another and stirring one another up unto love and good works, and that was really the focus there. But let me just share with you another passage, more than just the promise of that in the future. But in Luke chapter 6, verse 37-38, and you could turn there or just listen to me, there's a very interesting promise here. It's that promise of being given what you give, being rewarded on the basis for which you sacrifice and serve and invest in advance. But the very beginning of that, it's interesting, Jesus actually starts with an odd discussion and what it would seem to be in verse 37, Luke chapter 6. It says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged." He's setting up this idea of action and consequence. That's really what sowing and reaping is rooted around. But there's other aspects of that in our life which we have to maybe consider as we do look to invest wisely in these other areas of doing good to others and rewards that follow that sort of service. Well, as we look at this, he says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged." This doesn't mean being able to determine something's right or wrong. We're called to that kind of discernment. What this means is the sitting over another in judgment. I have declared with authority that you have broken the law, you have done this or done that. It's that taking on the robes that only God Himself should wear. In fact, we're told that we should not judge another man's servant. We are not his master. We are told that we need to be humble as we engage with one another. That doesn't mean discernment, but is meaning here, judge not, and you shall not be judged. Allow that to be in the hands of God. It's tied to this next word here, condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Now, these three stanzas of statement here in verse 37 are really tied together. It's talking about different aspects of that same kind of perspective, judging and condemning and forgiving versus enacting judgment. And this is interesting because he goes on to say, give and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. That will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And this is parallel. And the reason why this is so important for us to understand as we continue to invest in doing, not just hearing the word, but looking to invest in doing in the face of discouragement or disappointment, is the fact that sometimes our discouragement and disappointment are really because we've lost focus. It's easy to forget that these relationships with God first, in regards to judgment, condemnation, and forgiveness, really are the foundation for which we will be rooted, strong, and able to be able to serve, even in the face of disappointment, ultimately to a point where we will be rewarded for that service from God. So here's the question. Are we truly doing good in all things? And what I mean by that is in our heart. Is our heart where it needs to be? Are we judging and condemning? Are we holding on to grudges? Often that little aspect of our heart in the moment is really what separates us from that strength from God, because without that, we won't have that relationship with God. We'll be cut off from the grace that is needed to be able to be this kind of servant. Of course, it's not just this, but also even the question, how do I give? At what level am I giving? Am I truly giving and investing without expectation of return from them? Do I seek to be rewarded from God for my giving? Now, sometimes we can be discouraged in the midst of our investment because we're looking to everybody else to be the measure of our return. The truth is, if we're looking to man, whatever level, in whatever way in our life, to be there, what we need them to be, we're probably going to be disappointed. But as we look to God to be the rewarder, and we first root our heart and our relationship with Him, not judging, not condemning, forgiving as we have been forgiven, and we will find that strength that we're needed to be able to serve like we're called to. And so in light of this, one more thing, and this does tie to our focus. So first our relationship and that commitment to do good. We have to do that if we're gonna reap the harvest. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, is a question I have is, what is our focus? Verses 17 through 18 kind of hones our perspective in all of this. Our light affliction, maybe you are in that right now, and maybe you've watched the whole series on 1 Peter. But this light affliction sometimes doesn't seem so light. This is Paul writing. Of course, he suffered greater than any of us have been called to, at least most of us probably that are watching this. And yet he says it's a light affliction. Because he goes on to say, he continues to demean this present time of suffering, this present time of trial by saying this light affliction, even if it's that disappointment of those you sacrifice for, is but for a moment. Listen, this is only for a small time. This small point of time is working for us a far more exceeding, so small versus exceedingly large, and great eternal weight of glory versus temporal weight of glory, weight of return, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Now, this is another important part of our decision or struggling with being discouraged in service, and that is really, what's our focus? Is it on the eternal versus the temporal? Are you being discouraged right now because of temporal things? Listen, God is in a big business right now, and it's for eternity. And as you serve and invest in others around you, you're in an eternal work, not this temporary thing. And these temporary setbacks do exist. And Jesus himself, after 3 years of ministry, left a little over 120 that were waiting for the day of Pentecost. 3 years and thousands in which he served perfectly, wonderfully, miraculously. And you could look at mankind and say, wow, that'd be a pretty disappointing return for all that effort and all that work. The reality is he was working something so much greater. Are we willing to trust him? Are we willing to look to him and say, God, I don't understand, but ultimately you have this. Ultimately, God is your rewarder, and He is the one who will not miss any good that's truly done. 1, out of a love for Him. 2, out of a pure heart towards others. And 3, focused on that eternal good. It'll never be disappointed. And so there is reward in doing good if we will entrust ourselves to Him who judges righteously and empowers all of us to that kind of service.